as the Dean of the National Cathedral, both to support you in your work and also to connect you with the work that we are doing. Washington National Cathedral was founded in 1907, and the idea was that it would be the, quote, Westminster Abbey for America. And what the original founders meant was that it would be, in their words, a great church for national purposes. And so if you've been down there, it's at the corner of Washington, Wisconsin, and Massachusetts Avenues. It's the 6th largest cathedral in the world. It was built largely, we are an Episcopal church where we are the cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. But we are also the place where the nation has ceremonial occasions, presidential funerals, inaugural prayer services, things like that. But really for the first, I would say 70 years of our life, we were also a great sort of tall, steeple, social justice church. In 1907, when the National Cathedral was founded, that was the heyday of what we called the social gospel. Some of you may have studied that. Walter Rauschenbusch, the great theologian, great American theologian, wrote a book called The Theology of the Social Gospel. And part of the reason that the National Cathedral was founded in 1907 in its own language was not just to be a place to bury presidents, but to be a place, a beacon in the nation's capital for social justice. And most of my predecessors, up until about 30 years ago, were very active in social justice issues. Longtime Dean of the Cathedral, Frank Sayre, invited Martin Luther King Jr. to give his final Sunday sermon at the cathedral. He preached on Palm Sunday, March 31st, 1968, 4 days before King was assassinated in Memphis. Dean Sayre went on the Selma to Montgomery March with Dr. King. Dean Sayre was known as a kind of national figure, both opposing the Vietnam War and supporting civil rights. For a variety of reasons, the people between Dean Sayre and me have not been as socially conscious. But a couple of years ago, when the cathedral decided to look for a new dean, they said, and this may sound counterintuitive to people who think of churches as in a kind of retrenchment moment, but the chapter, which is our board, said we want a dean who will use the pulpit of the National Cathedral to take on social issues, important social issues, and will bring the faith community's voice to bear on important issues of national concern. And so they asked me to come, and they must have read my resume before they hired me, because I've been involved in peace and justice issues over the course of my ministry. I came into the church largely as a result of the civil rights and Vietnam War movements. My hero when I was younger was William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale, who was arrested with Dr. Spock and Robert Lowell and Norman Mailer on the steps of the Pentagon in October of 1967. My vision of the church has always been a vision of the faith community that is standing with and for the most vulnerable and most marginalized people in the society. It's a vision of the faith community that is undergirded by the Hebrew prophets. It's a vision of the faith community that's actually undergirded by the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran. It is a vision of the faith community that is undergirded by the teachings of Jesus. So what the National Cathedral is trying to do today is, I believe, consonant with what the faith community at its best has been trying to do all the way back to Moses and the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And I was pleased to see that tomorrow you are spending some time with Marian Wright Edelman, who spent the day at our cathedral last Sunday, and she and I had the distinction of being the lead bad people story on the cover of the Washington Times last Monday. Washington Cathedral hosts anti-NRA service, it said. So when you get knocked by the Washington Times, you know that you're in good order. So I've been dean of the cathedral for a year. I'm sorry to say that 2 months after I came, December 14th, 2012, the Newtown shootings happened. The following Sunday, I preached about the Newtown shootings and about the need for the faith community to do everything it could to mobilize the country for gun control. 2 days later, I didn't realize sort of what the pulpit at the cathedral meant. 2 days later, I was in the New York Times and the Washington Post and on every cable outlet, because for the faith community to take an unambiguous stand about gun violence was a kind of surprising thing to the media. We just heard some stark criticism of the media earlier, and I would say that, without sort of taking a position on that, they were surprised to see a kind of faith leader saying something about gun violence and the need for the faith community to take a stand. Now, to me, gun violence is not a morally ambiguous issue. I have a very hard time understanding the other side. There are people that say there's a kind of Christian case for the Second Amendment. I have a hard time imagining what that case would be. I don't think of Jesus. I don't read that Jesus even did a lot of hunting, you know. I mean, he was a kind of a peaceful guy. And so I know there's an argument in the Second Amendment camp for a Christian case for gun rights. But for me as a Christian, the issue comes down to, and as a Christian or as a Jew or as a Muslim, I would say, or a Hindu or Buddhist or Sikh or a Native American practitioner of any of our great faith traditions. The issue comes down to who do you identify with? Do you identify with the oppressors, or do you identify with the victims of violence? All of the great faith leaders in Western and Eastern civilization have identified with suffering, with people who suffer. And it has been at the heart of all faith traditions, not only to stand with people in their suffering, but to do everything they can to alleviate it. So when you talked earlier about issues like single-payer health care, or when you talk about Social Security or Medicare, or I would say, hunger, poverty, police brutality, the incarceration rate, all of the issues that so systemically bother us in America and in the industrialized world, the faith community is not in an ambiguous place about those issues, because we are called by Jesus, by Moses, by Muhammad, by all the great teachers, by the deep core of our faith. We are called to stand with people and to bring about what the prophets called justice in Israel. Shalom, the great Hebrew word shalom. That is the mission of the faith community, and as the nation's most visible institution of the faith community, the National Cathedral hopes to begin a dialogue about what authentic, expansive, hospitable, compassionate religion looks like in the 21st century. We live in a climate where the religion that gets press attention is kind of rule-oriented religion that is moralistic and is judgmental and seeks to divide people into categories and to stigmatize certain kinds of behavior. It seems to me that, as I read the Bible, that the Christian and Jewish scriptures, and I've also studied the Quran at their depth, talk about a vision of God and a vision of human society that is expansive, that is inclusive, that is compassionate, that is just. You know, when people, so the other big issue that we have taken on at the cathedral is marriage equality. The Episcopal Church, of which I am a priest, 2 years ago passed a new right for same-sex blessings, and in jurisdictions like Maryland and Washington and 13 other states now where same-sex marriage is legal, we are authorized to perform same-sex marriages. So the cathedral announced a year ago that we would start doing same-sex marriages. And the response to that, surprisingly, we may have gotten some negative response in terms of the Second Amendment stuff, in terms of the gun stuff, but we have received nothing, like 98% positive response to doing same-sex weddings. And so this vision of this expansive, inclusive, inviting, hospitable religion that we are trying to essentially put forward, that is a vision that I believe is most deeply incarnated in our scriptures, and the vision that we are all called to try to live out. I actually do have a little bit of an organized talk, but it's not horribly long, so bear with me for a second. Before I was, many years ago, before I had this position, I was an English teacher. And I loved the writing of a woman named Tilly Olson. I don't know how many of you have read Tilly Olson. I see a few hands nodding around. Tilly Olson was a wonderful writer. She was a Marxist. She had to quit writing at a young age to take care of her children. And she could not go back to writing until she was in her late 50s. And she wrote a wonderful little book of 4 short stories called Tell Me a Riddle. And that is one of the great classics of 20th century fiction. And late in life, she died in 2007, she was in her 90s. But from her late 50s to her late 80s, she really had quite a sort of wonderful second act of her life. Not only writing, but teaching and speaking. And it was my privilege, having taught Tell Me a Riddle for years and years and years, it's one of my favorite books, to go hear her speak when she came to UCLA, where I used to teach. And she got up, and I still remember, it was in this big lecture hall filled with people. It was around 1999 or 2000. And she said, you know, a lot of people, it was during the 2000 election, that's what it was. She said, a lot of people in this country are confused about what class they belong to. And she said, let me tell you, if you live off your paycheck, no matter how big that paycheck is, you are a member of the working class. And the tragedy of the current moment is that Americans have been misled into identifying against their own interests. That we have forgotten, those of us that are well paid, have forgotten that our solidarity is with other workers and is not with people who live off of capital. And she said, and she went on and on and talked about the history of that. But I've always remembered that remark because it was kind of so startling way for this great writer to start her speech. But her point was, it all really finally depends on who you identify with. We tend to endorse those we know and identify with, and we tend to shy away from those we don't. And I think our job, both in the faith community but also in the progressive community, is to help people in America remember who we all have common cause with. I thought what was being said earlier about the need for us to make linkages and with each other across causes. I went to Berkeley, okay, UC Berkeley in the 1960s, and I still remember at the end of rallies would deteriorate. It's, you know, there would be an anti-war rally, and then somebody would stand up and say, what about the grape strike? What about Free Angela? What about, you know, and the thing would fray, and we'd all end up fighting with each other. Because nobody at that moment was big enough to say, you know, we all have a common cause here. The grape strike, freeing Angela Davis, and ending the Vietnam War are all really about the same set of interlocking oppressions. So, but I think we are at a moment where those of us that organize around different issues, be they economic justice, be they violence, be they education, be they environmental issues, we realize that we have more in common with each other than we do that separates us. So I think one of the key principles is the Tilly Olson principle. Don't be confused about what class you belong to, no matter how much money you make. Don't be confused about what your real interests are. And don't be confused about who your cohort is. And that's the other example I want to use. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't tag this on to the earlier conversation about millennials, because I think it's really interesting. We in the church seem to be in the throes and the grips of something that is called generational sociology, which is that a lot of analysis is done about the difference between the so-called greatest generation, the baby boomers, the silent generation, Generation X, and the millennials. And there's a lot of analysis about the different voting habits, different consuming habits, different communicating habits, and all that stuff. Well, I've actually sort of had it with generational sociology, and I went and read up about Karl Mannheim, who was the founder of generational sociology. Karl Mannheim was a German sociologist who wanted to refute Marx. And Marx said that that essentially people identified by class, that there was a class struggle, and that the class struggle was what would eventually result in social change. Mannheim said, no, there's another way to think about cohorts. You don't have to just think of ruling class, bourgeois, working class. You can organize people in generational cohorts. So this is 1923. And so he writes this article, it's extremely influential, and it gets taken up by advertisers, right? I mean, well, you can understand that. Advertisers are not going to take Marxist categories, workers of the world, buy Budweiser. But instead, advertisers are going to take your generational cohort and try to sell you things around that. Now, the problem with that is that tells me that the most meaningful thing about me is the generation I belong to, and that I have more in common with other people who were alive at the time of Woodstock, or listen to Bob Dylan or the Beatles, than I do with either people that listen to Glenn Miller records or Justin Timberlake today. And the point again is that I think generational sociology has been used in this country to dissuade us, to mislead us into misunderstanding who we're in solidarity with and who we aren't. I don't feel my greatest solidarity with other people who went to Woodstock, or who, were of my generation. I feel my greatest solidarity with those whose economic and social injustice issues I think ought to be at the center of our American dialogue. And I think part of the job of the faith community, we are in the middle of this onslaught from advertising and from the commercialization of everything in our culture. We are all in the middle of this onslaught that is trying to treat us as consumers and is trying to essentially get us to identify with people whose objectives really work against our own interests. So following the Tilly Olson principle, I would ask you to think about who you are in solidarity with and with whom do you identify. And frankly, I have a lot more solidarity with a working mother who's not getting supplemental nutritional assistance. I have a lot more in common with a kid who is not getting a decent education and has to go to a public school and doesn't get a hot lunch because the meal program is shut down during the government shutdown. I have a lot more in common with those folks than I do with the people that are in the top 1% of America's national income. But for some reason, the kind of advertising machinery and the public relations machinery of our era asks us to identify with the 1% rather than with the 99%. And I think Tilly Olson always keeps us honest and on track when we think about her. Now, as the leader of a faith community, I only have 2 more points and then I'm going to stop. As the leader of a faith community, I want to say a couple things about where I think religion in America needs to be today. Remember that the First Amendment to the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. The First Amendment does not say that the church has no interest in the state. It says rather that there will not be an established church. That's a very different thing. It does, so when ministers like me come out and say we need to work against gun violence. We need to work for economic justice. We need to work for marriage equality. We need to work for environmental issues. When people like me come out and say that, people throw up their hands and say, separation of church and state. You're not supposed to talk about political issues. I don't think they were watching Jerry Falwell very much when they say that, but in fact, members on the other side have been doing that for a long time. But the faith community has a real stake in social issues, and remember, the civil rights movement began as a religious movement. It began the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, they were all clergy. And of course, the great Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi, was very much involved in that. So I think we need to have an expansive vision of religion in America, a vision that is compassionate and just and inclusive, that crosses all kinds of traditions. America is not a Christian nation. The founders, if anything, were deists rather than Christians. I mean, as an Episcopalian, I'd love to claim them all as my forebears, but in fact, many of them, like Franklin or Jefferson, actually were extremely skeptical about the claims of institutional religion. So again, the point of our nation is not that we were a Christian nation and we decided to keep the church out of politics. It was to say we were a nation of absolute total religious freedom that allowed every religion, even no religion, to flourish, but allowed all of those religions to be part of the national dialogue around these social issues. So the question for me now is, what does it mean to be a faithful citizen? And how can you be a faithful citizen in the 21st century, holding on to the values articulated in the Hebrew prophets, in the Quran, and in the teachings of Jesus? And again, as those teachings essentially move us towards compassion, towards economic justice, towards peacemaking, it seems to me that those are the questions that faithful citizens need to ask and need always to pose to their leaders. So at the Cathedral, we have taken on 3 issues very intentionally. I've talked about 2 of them. We've taken on LGBT equality. That includes marriage equality. That also includes holding up and standing with children, LGBT youth and teenagers, and smaller children, because they're bullied at home, they're bullied at school, and they ought not to be bullied in church. So making the church a safe place, a welcoming place, a sanctuary for LGBT kids, and also making the church and our faith communities places where same-sex couples can be married as well as opposite-sex couples. That's one of our major issues right now. The second one is gun violence, and we're doing that in collaboration with a group called Faith United Against Gun Violence and NARES Against Illegal Guns. You will hear from Marian Wright-Edelman about that tomorrow. I won't say much more. She has a lot more statistics in her head than I do, but just remember that 9,000 people in America have died because of guns since Newtown. 9,000 people. And of course, that's not just children in the suburbs. That is kids on our street corners and returning soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan. That is all kinds of people across the spectrum. So whether you're pro-Second Amendment or against the Second Amendment or neutral about the Second Amendment, the availability of guns and the way in which we tolerate gun violence in America is just obscene. And we need, as a nation and as a faith community, I believe, to stand up to it. The third is the race issue. One of the things that those of us in established religious and educational institutions are coming to terms with is the extent to which our institutions are invested in institutional racism. Now, I say that as the Dean of the National Cathedral in a denomination that has a number, is a comprehensive denomination, has a number of African American members, a number of Latino members, an increasing number of Asian members and Native American members. But the fact is that many of our institutions were built on endowments made because of slavery. And many of our institutions have institutionalized kind of racist policies, even though the people in them are personally not racist at all. I mean, you can be enmeshed in institutional and social and cultural racism and still not be personally racist at all, and still find yourself living out and implementing essentially racist policies. So one of the issues that the Cathedral and all of the Episcopal churches in the Diocese of Washington are now stepping into is an extended conversation on race, largely in result to the George Zimmerman verdict. The George Zimmerman, Kathy and I were in Los Angeles in the 1990s, and my wife Kathy is here in the back of the room, and we were teaching at a progressive school in Los Angeles, Oakland School, when the OJ verdict happened. And the thing we remember so clearly is how differently the white and African American faculty members responded to that verdict that day. And in many ways, the same thing happened with the George Zimmerman verdict. And so the Cathedral staff and the diocesan staff, and actually the National Church staff, have realized that we're still in a moment where there are these viscerally different responses to something like the Trayvon Martin case and the George Zimmerman verdict, and that we need to interrogate that as a faith community. So the National Church is having a national dialogue on race in about 3 weeks in the Episcopal Church, which will actually be webcast. If you go to the Episcopal Church website, there's information about that. I think it's November 15th, Friday, November 15th. There is a national dialogue on race, and we at the Cathedral are examining our own implication in institutional and cultural racism as we try to be more effectively the spiritual home of the nation, which is what we say we are. So again, I think all the work you're doing about all these issues, we always need to continue to do that work about our own social location. And we all need to realize that I'm a white, straight male, okay? And when I grew up, being a white, straight males thought they were normative. We're the way you're supposed to be, you know? And everybody else is kind of a deviation from that. And I think it's taken us a long time, some of us a long time, to learn that there is nobody who is normative, that it's okay for everybody to be who they are, and that white, straight male is as much of an identity as African American, lesbian, female. And that we need to claim our identity and accept our identity so that we can reach out to each other and embrace the other's identity and really work for the common good. Last thing, and then I'll stop, because you've heard all kinds of great speaking today, and I'm sure that this is about more than you want to take in. Kathy and I were out in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago, and we were part of a dialogue on interfaith issues in schools. And it was me and a rabbi and a Roman Catholic school head and a Muslim woman school head from Orange County. And, you know, the men, we were all talking about all these sort of lofty, kind of abstract ideas, and the rabbi was telling stories, and, you know, I was giving anecdotes, and this wonderful Muslim woman at the end of the conversation said, you know, there are two kinds of people in the world, those that have love in their hearts and those that don't. And I think ultimately, you know, it was one of those moments that kind of clarified everything for everybody. We sort of was like, yeah, right, that's what we're talking about, you know. And it seems to me finally that what the faith community brings to this conversation is a hope that those of us that have love in our hearts, those of us who empathize with the oppressed, with the marginalized, with the poor, with the sick, with the lonely, with the outcast, with the other, with the stigmatized, with the victim of the hate crime, with the person who has no health insurance, with the person who has no school lunch, with the person who has no health care, that those of us who have love in our hearts can work together to make the lives of those people better than they are. And we can do that because we follow Tilly Olson and not Carl Mannheim. We're not confused about who we are, and we're not confused about who we're in solidarity with. We are all members of the working class, and we are all people who are potentially the poor, the sick, the bereaved, the lonely, the lost, and the marginalized. That's the point Jesus is making in the Beatitudes when he says, "Blessed are the poor, for there shall be the kingdom of heaven." We are all those people. And the fact that we may not be at this moment is a temporary spot of great good luck. But let us remember that the people that Jesus cares about and that all great religious traditions care about, those people are us, they are our brothers and sisters, and our job is to do what we can to ensure that they get what they deserve and what is rightfully theirs in this land of incredible abundance. So that's what I think it's all about. I thank you so much for your patience. I know you've heard a lot of talk, but it's great to be with you today. Thank you so much.